Okay, today's project is going to be to convert this 1-barrel 300 inline 6 into a 2-barrel setup using a motorcraft 2100 carb. So this engine right here in this 85 Bronco has already had a couple of minor modifications made to it. The first being it has an EFI era split exhaust manifold. So you can see an outlet there, and then there's the rear bank there. So we actually have dual exhaust on this thing. The next is to the ignition. We got rid of that overly complicated setup and went to the old reliable HEI GM ignition. Other than that, the engine is stock. We have upgraded the 4-speed manual to a more modern 5-speed, and this is a daily driver. So we have more exhaust flow. Let's try to get a little bit more fuel flow. We're going to be kind of limited on what we can do as far as gains because we are not replacing the intake manifold, which in itself is pretty restrictive. Really, the only thing they offer for these engines is like the Offie 4-barrel intake, which the price of those and just running a 4-barrel is just too much. We want something a little bit more mild, better on economy. So we're just going to see if we can easily put a 2100 on here and if we can tell any difference. So I'm going to start by tearing this apart, getting the old carburetor, air cleaner, all that off, and trying to mock this up to see if we can fit it. Okay, just an update. Got everything off. I went ahead and pulled the studs out of there. Here is my adapter. I was just trying to figure out which orientation is going to work best for this carburetor, and I found I'm going to do something like that. So the carburetor will sit in there in the normal orientation that it would on a 302 or 351 where these were normally used. And I have just enough clearance between the throttle linkage and the valve cover. I'm running a thick gasket on top, not only to space the carburetor up to help get me a little bit more clearance, but you can see the profile of that spacer does not perfectly match the profile under here. And we have all these passages around the outside of our actual throttle bores. So if you don't run a thick gasket, air tends to seep into there and you don't have an idle circuit, or you have a huge vacuum leak, which we don't want. So the thick gasket will solve that issue for us. So what am I going to do now? Well, I can't run the original studs because they're too long. I don't have one here to show you. Actually, here they are. So here is the original studs. Of course, it's too long to use with the spacer. I went to the drawer and found some fine threaded bolts that are the same size and thread. So I can just bolt the adapter plate right down to the intake. The only thing I have to do here is the holes in the adapter are a size small, so I just have to step them up one size for these bolts to fit, put a gasket underneath, and bolt that down. Now the reason for using a bolt instead of a stud is, or my thinking, if you had nuts and they were to back off, you run a greater risk of them falling down in the intake, whereas a bolt is going to be held in with this plate and less likely to end up in the intake. I'm about ready to put my adapter on. Something to clarify here, I was actually looking at the wrong end of the stud. It's not the fine threaded end that goes into the intake, it's actually the coarse thread. So as a result, I had to find some coarse thread bolts here. I'm using my original base gasket instead of the one that came with the kit because this one's a little bit thicker and I think it's going to do a better job of sealing than the paper thin one there. I took a Dremel and just clearanced lightly around where the bolt head's going to go, so I didn't have any interference. It was a tight fit. And I have a little copper washer on either side just to space it up a hair to help with that clearance, just to be sure. Okay. I've measured the length of the bolt sticking out to make sure that it's not going to bottom in the intake manifold before I actually get this tight. I'm going to go ahead and put some blue Loctite on these bolts so I don't have to worry about them backing out, and I'll get this thrown on there. All right, that's on and snugged up. Now it's time to put the gasket on and test fit our carburetor. So make sure we get the gasket in the right orientation. It looks like it's the same all the way around. Let's see. Okay. Looks pretty good. Now to drop the carburetor on. Anyway, we have plenty of clearance around our throttle, full range of motion there, and look how close our fuel line is to connecting right up. So I just got to steal the filter out of the original, screw into there, twist this line, and I can connect that up with no modifications to the original hard line. Our electric choke was originally in roughly that location, so that should plug back in. And really the only thing left is to figure out our throttle bracket so I can connect it back up to our linkage here. So I'm going to go ahead and start by bolting down the carburetor to our adapter, because it looks like we won't have any troubles there, and go from there. This is actually working out pretty good so far. I got the carburetor bolted down. I took the filter out of the other carburetor, the original, threaded right in, put some Teflon tape that's safe for gas on there before I threaded it in, and then just had to flex, twist this hard line a little bit, and hook that right up. So our fuel supply is done. We didn't have to modify the original truck permanently in any way to do that. Carburetor is bolted on. So really, the last couple things we need to figure out, most importantly, is the throttle linkage. We need to reconnect our vacuum hoses to this carburetor and the choke. I was hoping I could just plug the choke back in, but it looks like it's a little bit too short. I can't reach around here to the plug. I did have an adapter harness somewhere for this, or it was on the truck originally. It actually lengthened the choke wire. If I can find that, that would be great. If not, this wire has already been spliced. I'll just splice in a new piece with the correct terminal, make this wire a little bit longer, and plug that in. So that's no big deal. Vacuum hoses aren't really a big deal. Really, all we have to figure out is the throttle. Now, my idea, since you see I have this unbolted, originally would have bolted to the intake right about in there. Of course, that's not going to work. I'm going to unhook the cruise control, or unbolt that bracket. You can see that cable is secured with these two bolts. That goes over to the cruise control module, which doesn't work. It never has. So it's not a big deal for right now. I'll just put that to the side and focus on connecting our throttle. My plan is to unbolt the throttle cable. You can see there. Mount this bracket the other way, flip it around, and put the cable through this direction, and see where that gets us. And what do I mean by mounting this backwards? Try to use one bolt hole and pivot it, so instead of it facing this direction, roll it around so it faces the correct orientation to actually hook up to this carburetor. We're going to start with that, see how close that gets us. We'll probably have to make a little plate that bolts to the stock location, and then drill 2 holes to mount this in the direction and placement we want. Because not only do we have to turn this to face this direction, we have to space it the correct distance away so we don't have any slack in our cable. So instead of talking about it, I'll just show you and get that apart. Okay, throttle bracket is done. So let me show you what I came up with here. I was able to reuse the entire stock bracket from the single barrel carburetor. I just had to make an adapter to bolt it in a new location, so to speak. So you can see down here, those 2 threaded holes, that's where the base of this bracket originally mounted. Now the base of it is over here, facing this direction. instead of downward. So I cut out a piece of angle. It's a 1/4 inch thick piece of steel just because I didn't want this whole thing to flex. But I noticed there was 2 existing threaded holes in the intake manifold down here. So I drilled 2 holes in my angle, bolted that up, and then drilled 2 holes on this side to bolt the base of the throttle bracket up. And I have some spacers right there, you can see, between the angle and the base of the original bracket to space this left or right so I could get it lined up with the carburetor so I wasn't pulling at an angle. Because I was able to reuse the stock bracket, that meant I was able to connect my cruise control back up and not have to lose that. The only problem I have with this is real tight to get this hose on for my breather, but I can always reroute that down to a fitting in the intake here at a later date. I extended the electric choke wire so I could plug that in right here. See, that's connected. And I connected my vacuum advance to the one available port on this Chinese carburetor, which was here. So now it is complete. And again, with minimum modification, that's the way I like to do these projects, because if I ever want to go back or undo what I did, I'd rather not have to, refabricate, recreate, or search for parts. I'd rather be able to just put it back. So I was able to do this without cutting or modifying my fuel line, without permanently modifying my throttle bracket, and without modifying the intake. So all of this is reversible. I still have to figure out the air cleaner and the breather on the front of the valve cover. Other than that, we're ready to fire it up and see how it runs. Here it is the next day. It's all done. It got too late yesterday for me to film it. It's too dark outside to see anything, but I did take it on a test drive, and it was driven all around today, quite a few miles. It seems to be doing pretty good. Go ahead and fire it up for you so you can hear what it sounds like. It does fire right up, which is nice. I mean, it always has, but have to wait for it to kick down off a high idle there. We'll go ahead and stick the air cleaner back on. All right, how about we go for a quick test drive? Here we go.